Welcome back. As we mentioned earlier, our focus this evening is on protests and why they become violent. South Africa has been dubbed the protest capital of the world. Since the early 2000s, more and more South Africans are taking to the streets to make their voices heard. The leading reason for these protests have been issues around service delivery. Some of these protests turn violent when residents clash with police, and in some cases, criminals use them as an opportunity to loot and steal. Since the dawn of democracy, the most violent and horrific protest to date took place in Marikana in August 2012, when 34 miners protesting over wages were shot and killed by police. No one has been held accountable for that tragedy. This evening, we will examine the legalities around demonstrations and also unpack why some protests turn violent. Our city journalists Sinolwazi April and Niki Hardeman spoke to Hugo van der Merwe, director of the Research Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation, to give us some insight into this issue. Let's have a look.
I'm Hugo van der Merwe. I'm the Director of Research, Learning and Knowledge at the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation. There are a number of causes that communities pursue. It varies from basic issues like housing and electricity, water, basic services that they need for survival. And then there are other concerns like jobs and issues of crime that also affect all of the communities. Well, essentially, these are issues that affect all these communities, but only some communities resort to violence. And that effect essentially happens mainly in those communities who don't feel heard by the government, because these are services that they are dependent on government to provide, and where people give up on the government, where they've tried to voice their concerns and the government doesn't listen, or has made promises that constantly don't get delivered on. And it's especially in communities where they feel they've voted, there's been the governance process that they thought would deliver, and these things haven't delivered. They've resorted to marches, to various ways of trying to engage government, and often in where these things, when all of this falls on deaf ears, communities sometimes resort to violence. And essentially, people have the right to protest, and that is fundamental, that we do recognize that people shouldn't be closed down. And I think we need to recognize democracy as a process of people voicing these concerns, and sometimes quite vociferously in an angry manner. And that doesn't mean that the government should close it down. The government should be very concerned when people speak in kind of through such protests. Sometimes, though, protests kind of escalate into violence, not because people kind of resort to violence themselves, but because the government responds in a way when the police, for example, declare a march illegal, they try to disperse people, or where the police are intimidating people, they respond in a violent manner. So things often spiral into violence rather than it being the choice of the community to resort to violence. So there's a very careful balance between the responsibilities of the protesters, of the organizers of marches, of the community themselves, and the police and government officials on the other hand. Where often it's a sense that it's a punitive response, where the officials feel disrespected when the communities don't deal with them in a way that they want, and they push the police to respond violently. So I think it is a process where we still don't have a clear understanding in our society of how people can voice their concerns, how they can escalate. And I think the government often still feels if you're not violent, it means you're not really angry enough. That they only respond once people become violent, and that simply encourages further violence. And there is an official process that people need to follow, because you need to get permission. The police need to sign off on a request or a kind of a notice that you are going to have a public gathering. There needs to be obviously traffic controls, and the police need to put in measures to protect shops and other public facilities. And sometimes the police use that as an excuse to declare something to not give permission. And then it becomes an illegal gathering, and the police sometimes then clamp down on that. So there's a very careful balance. People need to provide sufficient notification so that authorities can prepare for such a gathering. But there's a dual responsibility, and I don't think there's clarity yet under what conditions people can move ahead, and when officials can reasonably deny such a request. And I'm not an expert on crowd management, but essentially there are the regular police are not supposed to try and control mass gatherings or protests. There's special sections of the police who are called in, who are trained in how to effectively deal with crowds, how to negotiate with crowds, how to promote kind of more non-violent dispersal. So it's a delicate process of managing, of getting the right police in, of training the police appropriately. And obviously, too often we still see these situations escalate where police don't have the right weapons, they use live ammunition, or they simply we rely on police who haven't been properly trained. I think we're face a situation where a lot of people resort to violence because the avenues for protest aren't clear. I think firstly there are proper channels for people to apply to hold public gatherings. There are avenues for engaging with government through the development planning processes. There's consultation processes for development kind of plans through the city councils. Local councillors should be approachable by communities. They are responsible for having regular consultation meetings with their constituents. So there are all these avenues for engaging government, whether it is through the local council, through the provincial structures, and I don't think people have a proper understanding of what those functions are, what the avenues are, how you can write to local officials, even which officials should be approached. And there's some NGOs who've become very sophisticated in figuring out those channels and have used those quite effectively and embarrass the government and show them up when they're not doing their job properly. And that has kind of brought, I think, a more responsive government in relation to certain communities, whereas in other communities